Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're ditching the maps, the GPS, and definitely the comfortable airplane seats to journey back to a time when exploration wasn't a hobby. It was an epic gamble against the unknown. We're talking about ancient travel, how our ancestors, with little more than courage, curiosity, and some seriously questionable boat designs, managed to connect worlds, spread ideas, and literally map out the beginnings of civilization. So, before we embark on this incredible voyage, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into how humanity figured things out. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global community joining these historical adventures. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey across ancient landscapes and forgotten seas. Long before satellites orbited Earth or sailors shouted land ho, human beings were already on the move, tracing coastlines, crossing deserts, and scribbling their ideas of the world into clay, stone, or hide. Travel wasn't just about curiosity. It was about survival. The very first explorers weren't adventurers. They were gatherers and traders, hunters and refugees. But over time, movement became more than necessity. It became strategy, and eventually, it became legacy. The earliest maps weren't grand cartographic masterpieces. They were scratched patterns on cave walls, carvings on bones, or mental images passed down orally. Around 2300 BCE, the Babylonians etched one of the first known maps onto a clay tablet not of the world, but of a single region, marked with rivers, towns, and mountains. To them, the earth was a flat disk surrounded by a cosmic ocean, with Babylon, naturally, at the center. It wasn't geographically accurate, but it reflected something even more important: intent. These people wanted to understand their surroundings. They wanted to navigate. But how do you travel without roads, signage, or star charts? You watch the sun, you study the stars, you memorize the terrain, the migration of animals, the direction of the wind, and if you're lucky, you pass that knowledge to someone who remembers it better than you. Ancient Polynesians, for instance, mastered navigation using ocean swells, bird flight paths, and the position of constellations. Meanwhile, traders in Mesopotamia followed river routes like the Tigris and Euphrates, turning seasonal floods into shipping lanes. In these early civilizations, travel was rarely solo. It was communal, slow, and often dangerous. Travelers risked bandits, storms, disease, and simply getting lost forever. But they also brought goods, languages, ideas, and technologies across regions. Trade routes began to form like veins across the body of the ancient world. Exploration didn't need to reach new continents to be revolutionary. Sometimes it was enough to reach the next city-state, the next oasis, the next fertile valley. Those tiny steps created the web of interaction that would become civilization itself. So when we speak of ancient exploration, we're not just talking about distant journeys. We're talking about a primal urge to know what lies beyond the horizon and to leave a footprint on the unknown. The ancient Egyptians weren't known for wandering far and wide, but when they did travel, they did so with flair, ritual, and often an armed escort. The Nile was their highway, and it wasn't just for pleasure cruises. Pharaohs dispatched expeditions south to Nubia, east into the Sinai, and even further into mysterious lands like Punt, a semi-mythical kingdom that Egyptians called God's Land. Its location is still debated. Somalia, Eritrea, southern Arabia. No one's quite sure, but what's certain is that the Egyptians sent ships there loaded with goods and prayers, hoping to return with incense, gold, exotic animals, and a sense of divine prestige. One of the most famous recorded expeditions occurred during the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, Egypt's formidable female pharaoh. Around 1478 BCE, she launched a voyage to Punt and proudly recorded the journey on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. The carvings depict massive ships, men carrying myrrh trees, and locals with unusual features and elaborate headdresses. This wasn't just trade, it was diplomacy, propaganda, and spiritual alignment all rolled into one. Egyptians also ventured into the Sinai Peninsula, not just for conquest, but to mine turquoise and copper. These expeditions often involved hundreds of workers, scribes, soldiers, and priests. Travel was state-sponsored and heavily documented. Pharaohs weren't sending lone adventurers, they were deploying logistical machines. Officials recorded everything: what was mined, who participated, and how many offerings were made to the gods to ensure a safe journey. Despite being surrounded by deserts, Egypt wasn't isolated. Caravans moved through the western desert, connecting oases and bringing in goods from as far as Libya. Sea travel, though dangerous, allowed contact with Byblos, Crete, and other eastern Mediterranean ports. But make no mistake, ancient Egyptian travel was not easy. Whether by land or boat, expeditions were slow, risky, and costly. Yet they were seen as essential extensions of divine order. When the pharaoh moved, Egypt moved, and every journey reinforced their worldview. That Egypt was the center of the universe, and everything else, whether friend, foe, or foreign, existed to be known, tamed, or honored. For them, exploration was not rebellion against the gods, it was service to them. It's pretty amazing to think of these massive, state-sponsored expeditions happening thousands of years ago, isn't it? What part of Egyptian exploration fascinates you the most? Let me know in the comments. Alright, if you're enjoying this ancient travelogue, give this video a thumbs up. It really helps more people discover these incredible historical journeys. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's your chance. If ancient Egypt looked inward toward its river and gods, the Phoenicians were the ones staring out across the sea and building ships to chase the horizon. Emerging around 1500 BCE from the coastal cities of Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, in present-day Lebanon, the Phoenicians didn't conquer land. They conquered water, and in doing so, they became the ancient world's most daring navigators and traders. They were not an empire in the traditional sense. No vast armies, no towering ziggurats, but they built something arguably more impressive, a network. The Phoenicians established trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean, from the Levant to North Africa, to Cyprus, Sicily, Spain, and even to the mysterious edge of the Atlantic at the Strait of Gibraltar. Along the way, they founded cities, the most famous being Carthage, which would later rival Rome itself. What made them successful? Boats, sleek, fast, and durable. Phoenician ships were the marvels of their day. They used a combination of oars and sails, with high hulls for protection, and curved designs that cut through waves. These weren't just transport vessels. They were floating marketplaces, loaded with cedar wood, glassware, textiles dyed with their famous purple pigment, and alphabetic script carved into stone and traded like high-tech Yes, the Phoenicians also gave us one of the greatest tools for human connection, the alphabet. Their script simplified writing, moving from cuneiform and hieroglyphs to a system of just 22 characters. It would go on to influence Greek, Latin, and eventually Afur, or modern alphabets. But travel for the Phoenicians wasn't without peril. Pirates prowled the waters. Storms could crush ships into splinters, and every new harbor brought the risk of unfriendly locals or economic competition. Still they persisted, not as conquerors, but as connectors. They brought tin from Britain, silver from Iberia, papyrus from Egypt, and spices from Arabia. Some sources, including Herodotus, even claim that Phoenician sailors, under Egyptian sponsorship, circumnavigated Africa as early as the 6th century BCE. That's a bold claim, but if anyone in the ancient world could have pulled off such a feat, it was probably the Phoenicians. They didn't build monuments. They built routes, and in doing so mapped the heart of the ancient world through wind, wave, and trade, while Mediterranean sailors cut across waves and traded city to city. Far to the east, another kind of journey was unfolding, slower, bustier, and just as transformative. In ancient China, travel didn't mean ships on the sea. It meant caravans crossing deserts, winding through mountains, and braving some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. This was the beginning of what we now call the Silk Road, a vast network of overland routes that connected East Asia with the Middle East, Central Asia, and eventually Europe. Its origins trace back to the Han dynasty around the 2nd century BCE, when the Emperor Wu of Han sent an emissary named Zhang Qian westward to establish alliances against nomadic invaders. Zhang Qian failed in his political mission, but in doing so he accidentally discovered entire civilizations beyond China's western frontier. He returned years later with stories of Persian goods, Central Asian horses, and exotic cultures. The emperor wasn't thrilled about the delay, but he was fascinated by the possibilities. Trade routes blossomed. Chinese merchants began exporting silk, lacquerware, spices, jade, and porcelain products, so desirable that they became status symbols from India to Rome. In return, caravans brought back horses, glassware, wool, and gold. But it wasn't just goods that traveled. Ideas, technologies, and religions crossed borders. Buddhism moved from India into China. Art styles merged. Instruments were exchanged. Even paper, invented in China, would eventually find its way west, revolutionizing written communication. But Silk Road travel was brutal. Caravans crossed the Taklamakan Desert, nicknamed the place from which no one returns. Sandstorms could bury travelers. Thieves lurked in remote passes, and the sheer distance, thousands of miles from Chang'an, modern Xi'an, to cities like Samarkand or Antioch, could take months or even years. Travelers relied on oases where small trading cities flourished, like green jewels in the desert. Dunhuang, Kashgar, Merv. No single empire controlled the whole road. It was kept alive by a patchwork of kingdoms, tribes, and city-states, each maintaining a piece of the route and taxing what passed through. And yet, despite its complexity, it worked, creating a web of connection that reshaped the ancient world. The Silk Road wasn't a single trail, it was a circulatory system, pumping life, belief, and ambition across continents, while deserts, rivers, and seas posed major obstacles to ancient travelers. The Persian Empire took a different approach. They built roads, long, durable, well-maintained roads, and not just for the sake of moving armies or goods. For the Akokina Kasmeni Persians, roads were the infrastructure of empire itself, a way to tie together a patchwork of conquered lands, languages, and cultures into a single coherent system. At the heart of this vision was the Royal Road, commissioned by Darius the Great in the 5th century BCE, stretching over 500 miles from Susa in Persia to Sardis near the Aegean Sea. This highway connected the empire from east to west, enabling couriers, merchants, and military officers to traverse vast distances at unprecedented speed, thanks to a system of relay stations with fresh horses and supplies. Royal messengers could cover the entire route in just 7 to 9 days, a stunning achievement for the time. For comparison, the average traveler or caravan would take about 3 months, but the road wasn't just fast, it was secure. Patrols, fortifications, and outposts ensured safety for those who traveled under the king's banner. Travelers from across the empire, from Babylonian scribes to Greek diplomats, used the royal road not only to move goods, but to move ideas, rumors, and politics. In many ways, it became the empire's information superhighway. The Persian Empire's road system extended beyond the royal road, linking cities like Ecbatana, Persepolis, and Babylon, and stretching out toward Egypt, India, and Central Asia. Way stations called caravanserais offered rest and supplies for weary merchants and travelers. These structures would later become vital components of Islamic and Silk Road travel centuries down the line. More than just infrastructure, Persian roads symbolized the empire's desire to unite its many parts, not through force alone, but through connection by standardizing coinage, weights, and languages used for official communication. The Persians made it easier for people to interact, trade, and participate in the imperial economy. In a world where most movement was slow and chaotic, Persia offered something revolutionary: order, structure, and a system designed for long-distance travel. In short, the Persians didn't just rule an empire, they engineered it. The Greeks weren't empire builders in the traditional sense, not early on at least. What they were, however, was incredibly curious. From Herodotus to Pythias, Greek travelers roamed the ancient world seeking knowledge, trade, and sometimes just pure wonder. Exploration for them wasn't always about conquest. It was a way to ask questions, collect stories, and map the unknown. One of the earliest and most fascinating explorers was Pythias of Massalia, modern Marseille, who around 325 BCE sailed beyond the known world, through the Straits of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast, and allegedly all the way to a mysterious northern land he called Thule. Many scholars believe he may have reached Iceland or Norway. He described strange phenomena, like the midnight sun and frozen seas, things Mediterranean readers thought were mythical. But Pythias wasn't a myth-maker. He was a scientist with a sailor's heart. Meanwhile, in the eastern Mediterranean, Greek merchants and philosophers traveled across Egypt, Persia, and India. Alexander the Great's campaigns in the 4th century BCE blew the Greek world wide open, creating the Hellenistic era, where Greek became a lingua franca. From Athens to Bactria, Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia became crossroads for goods and ideas. Travel was no longer an exception. It was an expectation. Then came the Romans, the engineers of empire. The Romans took travel and paved it, quite literally, with their famous road system. They connected cities across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. At its peak, the Roman Empire boasted over 250,000 miles of roads, including more than 50,000 miles of stone-paved highways. Roads like the Via Appia, built in 312 BCE, were feats of engineering designed to last, and many of them still exist today. Roman roads served the military first, enabling legions to move rapidly to crush rebellions. But they also enabled commerce, postal services, pilgrimages, and even tourism. Wealthy Romans visited Greek temples, Egyptian pyramids, and spa towns in Gaul. Guidebooks and travel anecdotes became popular reading. To the Romans, travel wasn't just practical. It was a statement. Roads proved the empire's reach. If a road led to your town, it meant you mattered, and with every mile laid in stone, Rome reshaped the ancient world's sense of distance and connection. While land routes like the Silk Road carried caravans through deserts and mountains, another network, just as vast and ancient, stretched across the waters of the Indian Ocean. These were the maritime Silk routes, connecting ports from East Africa to India, from the Arabian Peninsula to Southeast Asia. Long before the age of sail, sailors were navigating monsoon winds, crossing enormous distances, and turning the ocean into a global marketplace. The key to it all: monsoon winds, predictable seasonal currents that reversed direction each half of the year. Ancient mariners learned to time their journeys with the winds, heading east when they blew in from Africa and west when they reversed. With this knowledge, ships could reliably cross the open ocean, making voyages that once seemed impossible. Indian merchants sailed from Gujarat and the Tamil coast, exporting spices, textiles, gemstones, and ivory. In return, they imported horses, incense, gold, and even exotic animals. Arab traders from ports like Aden and Oman carried goods to and from the Gulf, while East African merchants in places like Rapta traded ivory and tortoiseshell. Chinese vessels, especially during the Han and later Tang dynasties, also ventured into the mix, exporting silk, ceramics, and lacquerware. By the 1st century CE, Greek and Roman ships were arriving in Indian ports like Barigaza and Muziris, bypassing overland routes entirely. A Roman-era guidebook, The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, describes in detail the bustling trade ports, goods exchanged, and routes followed by sailors across the Indian Ocean. This wasn't speculation. It was a manual for navigating global commerce. But the sea wasn't just a place of trade. It was also a highway for ideas. Buddhism spread from India to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia via maritime routes. Islamic traders later carried their faith across the Indian Ocean, shaping entire coastal cultures in East Africa and the Malay world. Unlike the often militarized overland empires, the Indian Ocean Trade Network thrived on pluralism and cooperation. Ports became melting pots of language, religion, and cuisine. A Tamil merchant, a Swahili sailor, a Yemeni imam, and a Chinese diplomat could all do business in the same harbor. In this ancient sea, the tides didn't just carry ships. They carried civilizations. Not all ancient travel was driven by trade, war, or empire. For millions, the most powerful reason to journey was faith. Sacred sites, Holy rivers and distant shrines drew pilgrims across continents, often at great personal cost, in search of healing, enlightenment, or divine favor. These were not mere vacations, they were spiritual tests, acts of devotion in motion. In ancient India, pilgrimage was central to Hindu and Buddhist life. People traveled to bathe in the sacred Ganges, visit shrines like Varanasi or Bodh Gaya, or climb high into the Himalayas to seek out mountain hermitages. These journeys, often long and perilous, were believed to wash away karma and bring one closer to liberation. Buddhist monks journeyed not just within India, but beyond, spreading their faith along trade routes into Sri Lanka, Central Asia, China, and beyond. In Greece, pilgrims flocked to oracles like Delphi, where the priestess of Apollo spoke in riddles believed to reveal divine insight. Others visited healing sanctuaries like Epidaurus, where offerings and rituals were performed in hopes of curing ailments. These sacred journeys doubled as social and economic events, with vendors, entertainers, and civic ceremonies, making pilgrimages community affairs. In the Roman Empire, religion was interwoven with state identity. Pilgrimages to temples and imperial cult centers were both acts of piety and political loyalty. Devotees might travel to the temple of Asclepius for healing, or make the trek to Jerusalem, then under Roman control, as part of Jewish religious tradition, especially during festivals like Passover. Pilgrimage was also a cornerstone of Zoroastrian and Egyptian traditions. Ancient Persians traveled to fire temples, while Egyptians made sacred journeys along the Nile to participate in temple festivals, such as those at Abydos, believed to be the burial place of Osiris. These sacred travels often blurred the lines between spiritual and political space. Roads were maintained not just for armies or merchants, but for the faithful. Shrines emerged along trade routes, and temples doubled as inns for pilgrims. As a result, pilgrimage helped knit together vast regions with shared belief systems and sacred geographies. Ultimately, these journeys were more than physical. To travel in devotion was to symbolically leave behind one's ego, comforts, and attachments, and return transformed. The body moved across the land, but the soul journeyed far deeper by the time the ancient world gave way to the medieval era. The foundations of global connectivity had already been laid, not by emperors alone, but by the countless travelers who braved the unknown. Merchants, pilgrims, explorers, and scholars had woven together a vast web of routes, overland and maritime, sacred and commercial, peaceful and perilous. What they left behind was not just footprints, but a legacy of exchange of goods, ideas, faiths, and technologies that would shape civilizations for centuries. Travel changed everything. The spread of writing systems, like the Phoenician alphabet, helped standardize communication across borders. Religious movements, Buddhism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and later Islam, all owe their global reach to the steady footsteps of wandering teachers and believers. Spices from India flavored Roman feasts. Chinese silk adorned Parthian kings. African gold crossed the Red Sea and ended up in Persian treasuries. But travel also reshaped how people thought about the world. Ancient geographers like Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, using little more than sun angles and logic. Strabo and Ptolemy mapped continents using second-hand reports and daring assumptions. Even inaccurate maps were steps towards something larger, a vision of a connected Earth, where distant people were no longer myth, but fellow humans on different roads. These roads, rivers and sea lanes, would eventually evolve into the great trade networks of the medieval and early modern worlds. The Silk Road would merge into Islamic caravan routes. Roman roads would be walked by Christian pilgrims. Indian Ocean, sailing knowledge, would be inherited by Arab, Chinese, and eventually European navigators. Perhaps most remarkably, the spirit of ancient travel, this urge to reach out beyond the known, endures. The modern world may be powered by engines and GPS, but its heart still beats with the same curiosity that drove Phoenician sailors, Chinese caravanners, and Egyptian emissaries thousands of years ago. They didn't have passports, credit cards, or travel insurance, but they had boldness and vision, and an unshakable belief that the world beyond the mountains, the dunes, or the waves mattered, that what lay beyond the horizon was worth the risk. And because they believed that, we inherited a world tied together, not just by trade or conquest, but by human movement itself. It's truly inspiring to consider the sheer determination of these ancient travelers. What ancient journey or explorer do you find most fascinating, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. Thank you for joining me on this epic voyage through ancient exploration. If you enjoyed tracing these ancient paths, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you don't miss our next historical adventure. Until then, keep exploring and stay curious.